let's dig in with our first session today, Evidence to Policy, Local Knowledge, National Strategy. We know that rural India holds immense and yet under-leveraged potential for intergenerational, community-led progress. But realizing this vision needs a better bridge between the big brains at academia and policy and tech to what is actually the development happening on the ground. And so we have here today people to discuss just that and to help us incubate an idea for evidence to narrative data to policy unit. So I'd like to introduce our panel and let me tell you who they are and a little bit about them before they come on stage. So hold your applause, please. First, we have Mekhala Krishnamurthy, an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at Ashoka University, also a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research, and a non-resident scholar at University of Pennsylvania's Center for the Advanced Study of India. And then we have Deva Dar, who leads the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Investments and Strategy Systems and Advancing Research for Women's Economic Empowerment. Joining us on video from America, late on the Pacific, I think, is Julia Lowe, who works on strategy and research with global health and social change organizations. She spent 5 years with the Gates Foundation and as an advisor to Melinda Gates, managing an $85 million portfolio. And of course, we have Rashmi Shukla Sharma, a distinguished IAS officer who retired as an additional secretary for the Ministry of Panchayati Raj. She's also the chair of the board of Transform Rural India and today's moderator. Please, let's give them a round of applause. Do you want to start?
Hello, everyone. So we are here today to think about, of course, TRI is always starting something new, but let me say it, that to think about something new that in TRI language, I think that's old, no? To say something, TRI is starting something new. Anyway, but it is. So So I'd like to, what TRI is thinking of is not yet fully thought through. And we really seek your participation, and especially the participation of the panelists here, to think through it and to conceptualize it and to take it forward. What briefly TRI is thinking of is a kind of knowledge center which sort of addresses these three questions, which I'll put up front, which is, one, do we know enough about the actual needs and aspirations of the people TRI works for? We do to some extent, TRI does. But by we, I mean not only TRI, but also a larger community, which includes government, which includes philanthropic organizations, and which includes academia, because from academia we expect that conceptual gains can be made in this area. So do we know enough, all of us? The second question that we are asking is, do we know what are the strategies that can be used to address these aspirations, these needs? Do we understand them? Do we know what works, what doesn't work, why it works, and so on and so forth? And the third question is, do we take decisions based on this knowledge? So that is the very broad background of what TRI is looking at. It is looking to let people's needs and people's aspirations guide larger systems, like the government, like philanthropic organizations, like academia, and to make it sort of the center of it, okay? So that is the whole sort of concept. The concept will be fleshed out, but this is the idea. the second thing that I want to point out is that we must understand that TRI is a great creator of knowledge already. So I would like to point out it is a great creator of knowledge because it is an innovative organization and it works closely with people at the grassroots. And I think this particular combination of working at the grassroots and thinking, when they go together, is one of the most creative sort of situations that you can come across, okay, when the two happen together. So you're all aware, everyone else here is aware of TRI's work at the grassroots, but I would also like to point out the fact that this kind of work and the innovative approach leads to significant knowledge creation is indicated by the fact that there are some 150 persons, fellows of various kinds, this and that, who are engaged with TRI, not as workers, but while they support TRI's work, as learners in a very major way, okay? So 150 persons, and TRI is not, I mean, it has limited resources. People are engaging with TRI in order to learn. Okay, similarly, it has MOUs with 7 universities or academic institutions, Indian, plus with 3 fairly prestigious foreign universities. I mean, by prestigious, I mean which are interested in serious academic work. Also, it is working. So I would like to say that it proves that a lot of knowledge is being generated. But the only, and TRI is basically a knowledge generation, as other organizations which work in a thinking way at the grassroots are. That is a great site of knowledge. But this whole, because basically TRI began as a doer, you know. So this whole knowledge business is a byproduct, okay? And TRI doesn't really focus on it. It creates knowledge, but it's a byproduct, it's a secondary thing. The main work is the doing. So now I think it is very, very important that this whole knowledge creation that is taking place anyway is given a greater system, yeah, and a greater kind of way of sort of advancing it on its own, sharing it much more widely, and learning from it, you know. So if you create one piece of knowledge, if you understand one thing, it opens the doors for understanding other things and to think further. So I think this needs to be given a greater, more focused space in TRI. And this is what this whole knowledge center is about. First, asking the 3 questions about to what extent the voices of people TRI works with are actually heard, acknowledged, and acted upon in bigger systems. And second, how can TRI consolidate and propagate the knowledge it is creating anyway and build on it. So this is the background. Now, this particular session is divided in 2 parts. In the first part, I'll ask each of the panelists to take around 4 minutes and explain from the point of view of the area in which they are working about whether such an institute makes sense, institute meaning whatever it center or whatever it is conceptualized as, and if it does, how? I mean, in your work, how do you think it fits in or doesn't fit in? And secondly, after we have done this for 4 minutes, we will spend another, you can take up to 5 minutes also, another 4 to 5 minutes each, discussing of what such a center should look like and how TRI should go about it. So in this second question, we will have only very broad ideas at this stage. We will flesh it out in much greater detail later. And then we will open up the conversation, and we will also seek ideas from many of the very distinguished people who are sitting here. Thank you very much. So I'll start with Julia, because she's the furthest away and therefore deserves the greatest consideration and attention. Yeah? So should we start?
I was hoping that would be the reverse and I would go last. Well, thank you so much for making space for me so far away and for including me in this. I'm a huge, huge fan of everything Transforming Rural India has done and have followed along from the very inception. So truly honored to participate in this conversation and to learn from fellow panelists and everyone who's participating in this conversation. So I think the brief answer to whether or not I think dedicated capacity on evidence to policy is helpful is yes. I definitely think it's helpful. And at the core is because to acknowledge that although we often, I think, in knowledge production, research, evidence creation, knowledge work, it's often assumed that the processes by which it has impact would be straightforward or linear, that you make knowledge, it goes out into the world, and then, oh no, I see how big I am now. It automatically is translated into impact. And we simply know that isn't true, that it takes dedicated and specific capacity, skills, structure, and resources to actually drive knowledge into impact. And so I know we'll talk in the second half on what that could look like, but I think there's just a huge amount right now of innovation in evidence to policy work. And that at the core of this is the desire to really have most impact and to accelerate impact. Evidence should improve resource allocation, policy design, program implementation, and really support community aspirations. The core of what TRIF is really all about, and making sure that limited resources are optimized or used to accelerate progress on the social issues that matter to communities and matter to the organizations providing support to those communities. So, that's the promise of evidence and knowledge, that it really can drive and accelerate change. But what we know is that evidence production, so how research is conducted, and then how it's used, so how it's applied to policies, how it's applied to programs, and how it's applied to implementation, those are treated as separate and siloed things, that you would kind of make knowledge and then leave it to people to find, to implement however they see fit. And those silos do create barriers to change. It makes it slow, makes it inequitable, and it makes it just inefficient. And so on the production side, you have inefficiencies because it's often just misguided. The research might be asking the wrong question. It might not be relevant to the communities where research is being conducted. And then it's inefficient in use as well when people need to, in an unsupported way, maybe find relevant knowledge. You're kind of open to misuse, to cherry picking information, to, when you're not supported, to identify the best use. And then importantly, you're not able to take all the success and all the amazing work that's happening within communities, within programs, and really contribute that to a growing knowledge base, help influence other programs and other policies around the world. And so what all of this means is that intermediaries between production and use play a really important role. They play a translation role, a brokering role, matchmaking, and there's a huge amount of process innovation and methodological innovation and how that happens. But the most important thing is understanding the folks you're serving. And it is having the trust of the communities you're serving, the policy and practice institutions that you're serving, and being able to kind of guide that knowledge work with relevance and intention. And I can't think of a better organization that's better suited to do that than Transforming Rural India. So that's why I think right now would be a big opportunity, and why Transforming Rural India would be so well placed to take on and build this type of work. So thank you for the time, and so look forward to hearing what the other panelists say.
like to, yeah.
Hi everyone, and it's great to be here. Following on from Julia, who I think already laid out the sort of broader conversations that have been happening for over a decade now on evidence to policy, in terms of the different kinds of roles that people can play, whether it's, as she said, knowledge translation, brokering, exchange, embedding, seconding people, creating advisory groups. I mean, so many different strategies have been tried. What I think is very new and interesting about what TRIF is proposing is actually thinking not just about policy as being generated in the corridors of power or by decision makers, whether it's in philanthropies or governments, but actually thinking about what that knowledge translation looks like to communities. I mean, I think something we've been grappling with as well is that a lot of the knowledge or data collection or evidence gathering is in many ways, the way it's created is an extractive industry, right? So we're collecting data from communities, we're collecting data from the people who are driving the sort of change on the ground, but how that's translated back to them is not at all clear and evident. In fact, it's not at all clear that, even for us as a philanthropy, we work with so many partners who are generating very unique insights. And one of the things we've been grappling with is how do you actually translate some of this knowledge back to communities and facilitate that exchange, not only in sort of national conversations, but international, global conversations. What India has already achieved in the livelihoods journey, in the work with women's collectives, are places that are just starting points for other geographies we work in, for example, in Ethiopia or in Kenya. There is so much to learn and share within the sort of country, but also globally. And I think these are all things that we are starting to discuss, and I'm looking forward to these conversations. I think this is an opportunity to be an exemplar, because things have only happened at the margins so far in terms of actually thinking about evidence translation to communities. When I think about things like Khabar Lahariya, or I think about how Ideas for India has a Hindi page to generate, what otherwise stays in an ivory tower back to communities. These are efforts that have been happening on the ground. Lots of innovation and thought has gone into them, but there isn't necessarily a central institution that is thinking about doing this holistically. Gender Samvad has been a huge success as well in the sort of NRLM space in terms of actually connecting or facilitating dialogue between women and grassroots communities as well as governments, from the secretary all the way down to women in groups. But I think these are things that have been new initiatives that need to actually be thought through and brought together in terms of sort of the next phase of evidence to policy. And so I'm looking forward to some of the thoughts and discussions here on that. I thought what the most innovative thing I've seen so far is TikTok videos of academic papers to actually reach out to youth. So, breaking down really, really difficult concepts in academia that otherwise are inaccessible to youth, to young people, and actually making them cool, making them digestible, and making them part of the sort of daily conversations that adolescents are having. I mean, this is in some ways the cutting edge as we think about what does sort of the future look like in terms of communications. So I think there's a lot of potential to, I shouldn't, give TikTok the kind of place that it deserves, but the idea of making action possible based on evidence in digestible formats, which I think is really interesting. So, yeah, hopefully we chat a little bit more about that.
Thanks. Thank you all for having me here and on this really exciting panel, and for this really, I think, very, very exciting and timely And yeah, I think we're already starting to get into the how, but I want to just step back to the why for a minute, and building, I think, on both Julia and Diva, but also sort of turning it on its head a little bit. So the first thing is I'm here in part as an anthropologist, and anthropology is a very funny discipline. We like to think we are closest to the idea of the people, and we work with communities and society, so that's the way the discipline is. It's also a discipline which is most inherently suspicious of this, because it has its genesis in colonialism. So there is this inherent fear of alignment with power structures when you do this. So anthropologists listen to this kind of thing. We're also very suspicious, quite rightly in some ways, about any form of representative power, right? So even of civil society, elite networks, and all of this. So in one way, it's the discipline which will find this most exciting, and in the other way, that will be most wary of these kinds of efforts, which begin with this idea of translation, representation, intermediation, but often end up aligning with, and just to go back to TRI's own anthem at the beginning, this is actually about freedom and self-determination, not about greater and greater alignments with power, most of which have always been very beautifully articulated as in the interests of the people, which we know is the great form of colonialism and occupation. So that's the first point. The second is actually that I come here thinking about being an academic, and I think, Diva, you already mentioned the biggest problem we academics always have is the question of being the ivory tower, and it's a very, very accurate concern that people have had with academia and that we have as academics as well. But I started work 20 odd years ago, mostly on the ground with civil society, actually with the social initiatives group at ICICI, but it was all civil society organizations, and we were thinking about scale, and it was in Chhattisgarh and in Jharkhand and in these states that I learned. And so I was a very reluctant academic. So I came with these academic degrees. All the people I wanted to talk to were people who thought Harvard and Cambridge were really horrible places for good reason, and were suspicious of those places. They were the ones I wanted to spend time with. All the people who wanted to hire a young graduate from those places, I was not so sure I wanted to hang out with. So I had this real tussle where I had to prove myself, and I wanted to be the implement. I wanted to work on the ground. I wanted to be part of civil society. And even in most recent work with state capacity, and we work with governments, often senior bureaucrats, and Rashmi will sympathize and empathize with them when I say this, would look at me and say, why do you sound like you want our job? And you want to implement things instead of doing your job, which is being the academic. And I would look at them and say, yeah, but most of the time you sound like you want my job, which is you want to be thinkers, and you want space to think and ideate, and you don't have this space and time. A fair few of them over the years have actually asked about doing PhDs. A fair few of them are doing PhDs, but they're desperate for the time to think and ideate. And I was desperate to do the opposite, right? And it was always in that tension where I wanted to do and they wanted to think that we did the best work. And so it used to always be a joke, a running joke between us, but it was also a very fertile and good tension that happened. And so it actually it's always been practitioners who have made me pause and not give up on academia. I was very quick to say, this is ivory tower, this is not enough, we need to get on the ground. They were the ones who said, do you understand what you're doing matters? It matters to us because we don't have the time to do it. So if you stop doing it, that's not great for anybody, right? Whereas I wanted to put all my force on the ground, they said, go be the kind of academic who cares about this, rather than the other way around. Don't abandon that field of thinking. And so for me, it's actually been the other way, right? And then the last point I want to make is actually, I think, the most important for what TRI is trying to do, why I got so excited in the initial conversations, particularly with Rashmi. I think the reason I think this is really exciting is because all my work as an anthropologist, from working with Nari Adalats in rural Gujarat when I was 21, they taught me how to think about power and what security and freedom and justice means in very analytical terms for women, right? Their articulation of what it means to borrow a symbol of the state but not own it. Their articulation of why a woman who wants to leave her marriage has to have a different notion of security, right? It was a theoretical idea, right? Not just a practical one. Like not just a, it was not just a practical idea, it was theoretical. Similarly, the Kachoriwala and Harda who very nicely said to me, Mekhla, आप कौन सी theory पकड़ कर ये thesis लिखने वाली है? Right? He understood theory and he theorized with me. Anybody who has worked with farmers know they are social theorists. And they can do Marx, Weber, Ulta, upside down in 100 exciting ways. To me, this is what is most exciting, I think, about what TRI is proposing, that it's practice to concept. I'm okay about evidence to policy. I think what we're missing are good concepts. We have called rural India backward. There was a problem with calling it backward. We have now labeled them, the same districts that were called backward, we have labeled them aspirational districts. I'm not sure whether that's a good or bad move, frankly. What does it mean? People in rural India always tell me it's better to be called backward than at least people invest in you. You call yourself aspirational, you're supposed to take care of yourself. That's a theoretical move. What do they think they should be called? I'm 100% certain rural areas have new ways of thinking about who they are, right? And how to even think about a region. We'll have a new concept of the region that will emerge if we ask people for their idea of what is a region, what is a block, what is a district, how to think about administration. So I actually think the reason we're not innovating enough on the ground is because we don't have new concepts. And I'll end very briefly with the sociologist Richard Sennett, who wrote a beautiful book called The Craftsman. And, you know, usually we say, I think, therefore I am, in the philosophical sense. But he says, I think because of what I make, right? In Craftsman, it's not, I think, therefore I make. It's, I make, therefore I think like this, right? And that's what I think TRI is really getting at with this move back. It's giving voice in a very different way. I think it's incredibly courageous, it's incredibly creative, but very difficult. And we can talk about some of the difficulties of doing it. But to me, that's what really is inspiring about the move.
So now I'll also throw a tantrum. I'll throw a tantrum because I always have this kind of fit whenever I'll talk from the policy point of view and government point of view. Yeah. Okay. So I'll talk a little from the policy point of view and governance point of view. So I could go on and on and on, but I'll not exceed my time. So this is something I really feel very, very strongly about. So basically in India, we have a very centralized policy making system, you know very well. And you know the kinds of things that happen, the whole sanitation campaign where you have bathrooms, toilets which are unused, you have a whole sanitation campaign without thinking about water, you have a sanitation campaign without thinking about behavior. So it's our policies at present are really, really highly centralized and not at all informed adequately by what is happening at the grassroots. Like there is some recent work that TRI is doing in which I am involved, and we are looking at malnourishment, and one of the things that has just come out very starkly is that this whole Anganwadi system is based on the assumption that people live in the village, when in fact now the poorest people migrate for 7 to 8 months. And what does that really mean for our social policy? So it's kind of these things, even these very major things don't penetrate. So I think, and also this is assisted by the fact that we don't have a knowledge base, enough of a knowledge base. So if you don't have something thrown in your, governments only work, I don't know, one of my old bosses used to say that the only way you can get things done in government is to be a nuisance, okay? So you have to make the kind of, it has to become a nuisance, that, okay, this is coming out, that is coming out. Then government moves, is forced to move because various electoral politics and such like. So so I think it's, from the policy point of view, it's very critical to create this base, and I won't say more on it. And secondly, I think it's very important from the point of view of grassroots governance. So I've been working for some years on grassroots governance now, and the kind of structure we have, it has developed historically, but if you showed it to someone who specializes in organizational structure or some such thing, they will die laughing. Okay, so it is so crazy because we have not reflected on it at all. Plus our ways of working, we are not even thinking about what works. There's a recent work in which Mekhla and I were both involved. We were looking at why Indore municipality succeeded in sanitation. So one of the findings was that the kind of contact they'd made with the community, for one, of course, they made it very central to their whole this thing. What they said, what was most effective was that someone reached out to people daily and told them, okay, segregate like this, segregate the garbage like this, do this. That is the kind of thing which had the maximum impact on behavior change. So that means all these grand campaigns that are carried out, these posters and these so on, so forth, maybe we are just wasting our money. And what you really need is the kind of strategies that actually work. So this is just a few examples of a recent kind of thing. So to get off my hobby horse, I really think that, and also I think government needs to learn a lot from NGOs about how to work on the ground. Okay, there are many significant threads that are clear, but there are others that are not clear. And certainly even those that are clear, for instance, at least to me, they are nowhere documented. Okay, so from the point of view of better governance, better policy, I think this kind of thing is absolutely vital. I think it's the one thing that is not there. So that's my opinion. So we'll shift to the next session. Before we start with the discussion with all of you. So Julia, once again, what do you think if all of us seem to say that such an institution, if it can be established, would be useful, would contribute something, and so on. So now here I'll seek broad thoughts from all of you, that what should it look like and how should TRI go about it?
Thank you again for the time. So I think there's so much that TRI could do. So I'll focus on kind of two very broad areas that I know could contribute a lot. And the first is really about shaping bodies of knowledge, shaping really dynamic bodies of knowledge. And so, and that's building and contributing to these bodies of knowledge so that they're comprehensive, they're relevant, and they're trusted, which are really the keys to making sure that evidence is actually put into use to drive change. So, there's a huge amount of excitement and innovation in the space that I'm really excited about from organizations that I admire, on building partnerships, on helping to redefine whose knowledge matters, what kind of evidence matters, what's considered important knowledge, making sure that evidence users, people with lived experience, communities that are impacted, communities where programs are being implemented, are actually shaping frameworks for knowledge, shaping frameworks for research synthesis, helping define research questions. So those processes are broadly co-production and engaged research. So building processes so policymakers, program leaders, and communities themselves are actually both driving research questions and methodology and working directly in partnership with research institutions to shape those bodies of knowledge. There's a huge amount of innovation in synthesis that I think is really exciting, both in rapid synthesis. So, what we know is that decisions are made every day in policy and practice without evidence. I make decisions every day in my life without evidence. Every policymakers make decisions without evidence, because oftentimes those decisions are really quick and you make them with the best available information to you at that moment. And so it's been exciting to see a lot of institutions develop rapid synthesis units where you have kind of methodological rigor and building kind of very high quality bodies of knowledge, but doing it on a timeline that can still be relevant to decision makers. So kind of rigorous evidence synthesis within 24 to 48 hours, which is amazing to see those institutions work. And also living synthesis that's supported by technology where, historically, if you do a quite rigorous synthesis, you would spend kind of 2 months doing it. By the time it's finished, it's already out of date because new knowledge or new research has come out. But now there's both process innovation, but also technological innovation that would help basically have continuous surveillance so that body of knowledge is always up to date. Timeliness is key in trust, so driving trust within that, and making sure, again, that it's reflective of institutions and communities' goals. I think part of this building on what Transforming Rural India does, the Colloquy is a perfect example of this, is really codifying and representing strong learning agendas. So when you're very clear about your learning priorities and communities working with communities to identify their learning priorities, it helps others contribute their own experiences and knowledge to that instead of you kind of having to pull everything in yourself. So I think all of that, can be summarized by basically saying, helping shape these bodies of knowledge. So you become shapers in a way and stewards of body of knowledge. And then the other thing that I could see this center doing is really helping facilitate use. So what does it take to support communities, support NGOs and organizations, and then policymakers in government actually take evidence and put it into use in policy programs and practice every day? And that work is, taking research evidence and contextualizing it, synthesizing it with local data, locally relevant knowledge, building partnerships and capacity, partnering, doing that kind of rapid synthesis I was talking about, identifying new resources to drive those kinds of change. There's organizations, including TRI, that have really innovated in how to use storytelling, dance, other mediums to actually translate evidence into local relevant currency for change. So I think all of that could play a part in that facilitation of use in a variety, both in policy, communities, and in the organizations that TRIF partners with. So I think, again, both of those sides of evidence work, kind of helping shape the bodies of knowledge and then making sure it's facilitated into use, could be a core part of the center.
Excellent. I think
Thank you so much for the time.
Very, very, very productive ideas. Diva, would you like to?
Yeah, no. This is something that we think about a lot at the foundation, working with a number of research and evidence partners on actually thinking about how does that translate into policy, how does that translate into action. And I think with this center, you're adding an interesting, as I said, an exemplar in a way of actually thinking about what that looks like with communities as well. And sometimes I think this is going to sound very obvious, but I think the biggest question that I end up asking most researchers or most academics or people working on research is, so what? Because, a lot of work has gone on into these interesting research findings on what works, what doesn't work. But what is often not spelled out is, so what? What's the next step? And I think to this question of thinking about those intermediaries who build that bridge with decision making, with action, I think it's really important to actually spell out what that means, and how that can translate into changes on the ground. So this worked, but what does that mean for next steps? So let's say, for example, in the context of NRLM, we know that the savings and credit from self-help groups can only get you so far, and it's really the sort of capitalization, the market linkages, the collectivization, many different elements that actually can help accelerate income generation, empowerment gains, and others. But the sort of obvious answer is not this has worked, but actually thinking about how does that translate into changes for institutions in India, elsewhere. So people who are now grappling with how do you replicate this kind of programming on livelihoods in other contexts and countries. It really, you need like almost like a handbook or a guidebook to spell out what needs to be done. And those things aren't necessarily the forte of academics or the forte of researchers. It needs the sort of people who understand both those spaces and are able to bridge those gaps and actually think about what actions look like. And this, I think, means that for a center like this, you need representation or expertise from many different domains. And I don't just mean disciplines, but I also mean people who bring that capacity in terms of people who specialize in knowledge production, in research, those who specialize in policy, but also those who specialize in practice and thinking about not only, I'd say, sort of English-speaking, educated experts, but who are on this panel today, but actually thinking about what that looks like on the ground as well, and actually having those voices reflected in thinking about what the center looks like and what expertise is needed. And to my sort of earlier point, I think communication then becomes an interesting avenue in terms of how do you actually communicate and to what objective. So if you're trying to communicate to school children, to young women who are at home, who maybe have access and not always have access to phones or to technology, or are you trying to communicate to panchayati raj institutions or to people at the district level? I mean, there are a range of options in terms of what we can do, and I think really sort of pushing the frontiers of what those communication formats and methods look like, I think will be really interesting. So I gave examples of Khabar Lahariya, or people who are doing, sort of influencers who are building videos in Hindi to break down concepts on YouTube, on TikTok, and so on, to break down academic concepts for young people to understand. But I think really thinking about what that could look like, so it's not just white papers, of which there are a lot in this world, or evidence that never gets off the shelf. I think that is really useful to think about. And I think the last piece is we are in a world of very rapidly evolving technology. And so as we grapple with thinking about how to communicate with people in different dialects, in different languages, in even synthesizing very rapidly changing information landscapes, I think thinking about how AI can be used and all the sort of innovations in tech and AI that can actually be used to pass on these benefits to others, both in terms of communicating and in terms of translating, I think will be an interesting experiment to actually think more about.
Thank you. Very interesting ideas.
I will, in the interest of being quick and keeping time, I'm just going to make three, again, very broad level points. The first is actually about, this is my, starting with saying I was inherently comfortable and excited and uncomfortable. My inherent discomfort with the word co in fields of asymmetrical power. Because co-production, co-creation, co-everything, when things are inherently unequal, is never co. So I actually sometimes think you should not start with co, you should do what you want to do. And let it be your vision. Let it be the vision of TRI and all the people who make it. Let others join you. It's very important because in fields where there is so much dominance, especially in academic knowledge production, it's very power-ridden. You know, what gets published, what doesn't. These are resources. This is a political economy of knowledge. And you can't create a new intervention in the political economy of knowledge and not pay attention to the political economy of knowledge. It exists. It is unequal. We have to intervene in it. So therefore, I would always think, actually, it's more important that we are biased towards our values, right? And I use the word bias. Like, you have to actually say, this is the value, this is what we believe in, this is what it's really about. And then we build around it, right? So we've been doing this work on relational state capacity. And we were saying that, actually, if relationships were good, you wouldn't have all that we talk about, participation, co-production, all of it would simply be implementation. It wouldn't be, we wouldn't have to add the co or the partnership and collaboration so much. It would already be in there, in the design of how we do it, how we implement. So that's the first point. The second is, I think, so well put here about policy and implementation. And we know this in the State Capacity Initiative at CPR. He's also here. We used to always say, there's no such thing as good policy and bad implementation. A policy that can't be implemented well or is not implemented well is a bad policy. You cannot talk about this constantly. India has good policies and bad implementation, good laws but bad implementation. Enforceability and implementation was never thought about when it was designed. It cannot be a good policy. So that's like, I think, the second thing we've all learned now, but we still don't do very well. The third is having good frameworks for deciding what questions you work on. And I think this is especially important. Julia was saying when you're doing field building. Again, at the State Capacity Initiative, when we were setting up this, trying to think about this work, and I mean, I would sit and discuss this. The way I used to think about it was three things, right? What is it that all of us seem to know? And when I say seem, I mean TRI. What do you start believing? You know to be true, like the daily thing is actually what works, or when we say, no, is air-conditioned room. So what are the things we know outside the air-conditioned rooms? And that the people in the air-conditioned rooms also know to be true, right? I think that India is predominantly still rural, is fast urbanizing. There are some data that we've all come to kind of all collectively share. So those are things you don't have to work on so much. What are the things that you really think you know quite well, but nobody seems to believe you? Even today in India, when you say that most transactions don't happen in mandis, or that people are still using cash to transact in villages, policymakers don't believe you. They keep thinking the APMC is the problem. And I'm thinking, God, you know, how many people, in Bihar, how many times will we say APMCs were, you know, dissolved in Bihar many years ago? They didn't even work before they were dissolved in Bihar in the same way that they worked elsewhere. Still people don't believe it. There we have a different problem. How do we build persuasive narratives? How does the data, the story, the narrative actually start to convince people of what is actually going on the ground? It's not that you need more research. You need to be able to make that reality evident, right? And the third is the kinds of things Rashmi was saying. There are so many transitions that are happening. So many different kinds of transformations in family structure, in the structure of the economy, in the structure of politics that we don't know about, right? Where welfare systems are changing, we don't know what is happening. That is where you need to do a different kind of field-building primary research. So I think having a framework for asking what kinds of questions, why are we asking them, what we want to do, that's, I think, really important. And then the very final point, I think everybody has mentioned it, is taking this, you know, field working staff or thinking of the implementers and the thinkers as separate. I think Rashmi said it very beautifully. Those who think when they work in rural India have known all this for a long time. Everybody I know in rural India thinks, right? And so thinking about them as thinkers in the design of the organization. That doesn't mean that you all have to do everything, because you have to run an organization. And you have to be able to do work simultaneously. But I think being able to structure it where for field workers as well as for the researchers, you're constantly taking them very seriously. And one of the biggest problems I've seen is those who are given research titles in NGO work are not taken seriously, either by researchers or by the NGO staff. This is a historical problem I've had. Neither the NGO takes people with research titles in their own staff seriously, nor do the researchers who collaborate with you take those people seriously. They are seen as your implementers, your RAs, your surveyors. And you, in the NGOs, also end up thinking of these people as not doing implementation. So therefore, doing some documentation work, maybe it's useful once or a few times in a year, but not as a daily thing. So that power, how do we design for it? Organizationally, how does one take surveyors seriously as workers, as thinkers, as ideators, as implementers? In an ATI that I recently, when we were doing some work with an administrative training institute, there's faculty at ATIs. And I went in and talked to them and I said, what are your research interests? Your professors in their assistant professor rank. And they said, nobody has asked me my research interest. And I was like, well, I'm also an associate professor. You're a professor. We should talk about our research interests. But nobody had treated them as actual faculty, although they had a title of faculty. So I think that's another thing that we have to really address in our organizational design.
Thank you, Meghla. So I think let me just take 2 minutes to sort of highlight some of the major points that have come, and I'll add a couple along with that. So I think we've got some very interesting points. Just sort of summarizing the first session, I think there it is very clear that both in terms of agencies that fund, in terms of academia, and in terms of government, the kind of work that is being envisaged would be of great use. I mean, there were many other points that came that you heard, but in this particular aspect, I'll only sort of say this because I want to move on to the next. Now, I think when people have talked about structure, what this institute should look like, a very important question that has come is that how should it select what it works on? Okay, so everyone has mentioned that. And if the agenda is that it should reflect the needs of the people, we've had slight difference of opinion as to whether we should involve people in identifying what is to be researched, or as Meghla says, be a bit upfront and say, okay, this is what I think and this should be done. There is, often, I see Meghla's point very much, because what happens many times, as she was saying, that when you co-produce, there are dominant voices that take over. So sometimes it's best to be upfront and straightforward in order to co-produce. But also, I think you can't also say that, there's a logic to both these things. So if you're not listening to people while deciding on the agenda, that is a problem if you're sitting here and deciding. But also we have to be very aware that when we say we are listening to people while deciding, more often than not, it's the person who is who's in a dominant position, who's leading the show. That happens a lot. So we have to be very careful of that, and maybe we can work out a method, by which we can ensure that what we are doing represents the needs of the community. So it will have to be a slightly more, I think we'll have to think more carefully about what that methodology can be. Okay, so, but everyone is clear that obviously it should reflect the needs of the community. It cannot just be a center which does what the research it thinks is important. Then I think the second very important point that both Julia and Diva has made is that it has to have a very significant communication component, okay, in which it has to facilitate the use of the work and maybe even the work of others, its work and other work, to reach a very wide number of people, very many kinds of people, okay, and the diversity was from policy makers to funders to ordinary people to students to so on so forth. So that has to be a very important component of what we think. Then I think the next step point that Diva made, I think that's very, very critical, because if you see, strategy formulation is a kind of exercise in itself, okay. It doesn't automatically flow out of research. So you can understand a thing, and this TRI people would know better than me, they being master strategy formulators, I mean the people who are actually working on these things, that strategy formulation is both a science and an art, which is, it needs a separate attention. So it cannot be sort of assumed that it will happen on its own. The other point that Diva made was that we must get expertise of, I mean, this cannot be a purely academic expertise. It has to be the expertise of doers also. And doers, not just policy, people who work in, as she said, air-conditioned rooms, but the people who work on the ground, and really many of them have enormous strategies. And in this I also include people, NGOs who work on the ground. Some of their strategic thinking and some of their understanding is incredible, it just doesn't get documented enough, and it doesn't get aired enough. And also I find of grassroots workers, many of them they develop all kinds of techniques which no one even knows about. So we have to include that as part of this thing. And then the technology use came. And one very important point that Mekhla had made, what did you say, Mekhla? Why have I not written that? Again, Mekhla stressed this tension between thinking and doing, and this I really wholeheartedly endorse. And I think what she said in the beginning about thinkers wanting to be doers and doers wanting to be thinkers, it really shows how actually integrated the whole thing is. And when people are forced into one category or the other, they're uncomfortable and they don't perform their best. So it's really a kind of sort of thing. And I think that the center, have I forgotten anything significant? Not noted down anything significant? Okay, it'll come back if it has been thin. I just wanted to add a couple of points. I really take these points and these are very good. So one point I wanted to make is that obviously I think this, I think Julia said this also, it'll have to network, it'll have to be a networked institution. It'll have to network with a lot of like-minded people, because it cannot possibly house all these expertise, all these kinds of competencies in itself. That would be a kind of those humongous organizations, and that is not the idea. So it will have to work through networks of like-minded people in various sectors, in academics, various kinds of people who, other organizations who are working on the ground, other kinds of people who are working in the knowledge space, who can contribute. So it will have to create a network. The third very practical thing, two more very practical things I wanted to say. One is that, to create a center which follows an agenda emerging from the ground is very difficult, because you don't get money for that. Okay? So it must have some seed money. Without that, it never take off. To at least be able to, I'm being very, very modest, at least be able to run 2 case studies at a time. Okay? Which are, so that its work keeps going, irrespective of whether people are willing to fund it or not. So it cannot be a donor-driven kind of thing. If it's a donor-driven kind of thing, then it's not fulfilling its purpose. Or a government-driven thing, the government says, okay, do this and we do this. So it has to have some core independent funding. We'll have to think about it, so that at least it can do some work, especially initially, to illustrate what it plans to do. Okay? So that is the third. There was one more thing that I wanted to say. This is, I don't know how much Mekhla will appreciate it. And Mekhla may, but I think most researchers would not. That it must not, I don't think there's any danger of it, but I'll just say it, that it should not become the kind of institute which says that I will only study things which I feel many academics do, which are easily quantifiable, studyable. So, because their reputations depend on it, because if your methodology is not top of the pops, you don't sort of, So what I'm saying is that it being an institute which doesn't want to make it into academics is relatively free, okay? So even if a topic is hard to research or discuss, it should be able to. So that's all. And I think, do we have time for questions? Yeah.
We are really running very, very short of time for questions, and there were some really good ones as well. I feel like you've summarized and so well that we've covered quite a few of the questions that we have here, and we will be having a short tea break after this. So I just wanted to get one question that is definitely something we haven't talked about yet, and a little potentially controversial one. How do you think the new caste consensus will effectively support the evidence to policy journey? Could we have 30 seconds from each of you?
The new caste?
The new caste consensus. Census, sorry. It would be nice if there was consensus on the caste census, but how do we think the caste census is going to affect this journey?
I can't say for
Microphone?
sure, but I think the more you know, the better it is. I mean, I don't see the problem of knowing affecting us negatively.
I mean, right now the problem of not knowing is affecting us very negatively, I think, across the board when it comes to data. But I think like everything, any census, from the very first censuses, again, anthropologists have spent a lot of time studying the census as an instrument of power. All censuses are negotiated things, and they're fought, and they're political, and they are constructions. So if it comes, its knowledge will no doubt be deployed for multiple interests. And the exciting thing about being on the ground is that you will have to see how people engage with it and what it throws up. I think it's very hard to predict exactly what that's going to do. But I think if TRI has this kind of center, its dynamism is going to depend on being able to have a thoughtful engagement with the caste census, both as a new form of knowledge and information, but also in terms of how it's being deployed by people on the ground, in different ways. So I think that would be, my sense. Also, I just want to say one thing, because Rashmi did such a great job of summarizing all of us. I think the new theory of change, we need a nuisance theory of change, or a theory of change via nuisance. I actually think there's a lot to be said for nuisance. And only people who work on the ground, who are either bureaucrats or people who are civil society people, will understand how important being a nuisance is. And again, that's what I mean by new concepts, right? Instead of just thinking about nuisance like that, nuisance value is a value. It is. Nuisance value is not a trivial value. And it's a rather important one on the ground. So I think that was a brilliant theoretical move, actually, right there. Thanks a lot.
So should we say the center will be nuisance?
I was just about to say maybe we have the right title for the new center.
The US has a big theory of good trouble. Right? Good nuisance is good nuisance. It's not a bad thing.
There we go. Anish, giving you a run for your money on the naming there. Can I just please, first I would like to say thank you so much to Julia, who stayed with us late through the night. Thank you, Julia, for joining us, and for all of our wonderful panelists bringing us this discussion. as a small token, can we have a photo of all of you? And then we would also, of course, like to give you a small token of our appreciation with some goodie bags. While we're getting the photos taken, a little bit of housekeeping. We'll be having tea. We are running a little behind schedule, so if we could have a very quick cup of tea or coffee so that we can get back in for our next session, which will be equally as interesting and rewarding. And please, ladies, if we can give you a small token of our appreciation from TRI. Thank you. We'll see you after the tea break.